Keeping your word is quite an important concept, and particularly when it's national. And a gentleman's agreement, often an unwritten informal understanding between parties based on trust, honour, mutual benefit by people who are in a position to take that agreement who are in position to make that agreement. This differs, incidentally, from the uh, agreement which is often cited in the comments section by Putin propagandists about the NATO enlargement to the east. That seems to be an agreement which was made by people who didn't have the responsibility for making it, if it was made at all, and it seems to be an agreement which wasn't put on paper. But an unwritten agreement between people who have the responsibility to make it is important. And historically, Britain cultivated a reputation for honouring such agreements, projecting itself as a nation whose word was its bond, whether in trade, diplomacy, or military alliances. One of the best historical examples of this was Britain's role in guaranteeing Belgium's neutrality under the 1838 Treaty of London. And while Germany violated that neutrality in 1914, so Britain declared war, honouring its commitment despite the immense cost. And similarly, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, British business dealings often relied on verbal agreements upheld without the need for legal intervention, reinforcing the idea that a British handshake was as good as a contract. However, in recent years, this reputation has frayed. The Brexit negotiations provide an illustrative case. Britain's agreement on the Northern Ireland Protocol in 2019 was followed by repeated efforts to rewrite or unilaterally override parts of that deal, straining trust with the EU. On the global stage, the principle of keeping one's word has also come under pressure. One stark example comes not from Britain, but from Trump's relationship with the Ukraine, which demonstrates the erosion of trust in Western commitments. And Trump has paused military aid to Ukraine. It was actually paused in 2019 as well, a decision entangled with the demand for political favours. And yesterday, this morning, Trump has put pressure on Ukraine to cede territory to Russia by pausing the military support. There was also the pause in October 2023, the crucial weapons package for Ukraine, delaying vital assistance when the country was at its most vulnerable. And Britain has shown similar wavering in its commitments. The AUKUS deal with the US and Australia, while an important strategic pact, left France humiliated after Britain reneged on previous security commitments with Paris. Likewise, the government's handling of post-Brexit trade agreements with developing nations, particularly broken promises on imported tariffs. This has all damaged UK's credibility and the credibility of the West in general. In sum, the principle of a gentleman's agreement once held Britain in high regard, but in a world increasingly defined by legal loopholes, political opportunism, and deceit, honouring one's word has become a fragile, conditional practice, and the implications are clear. Without trust, agreements, whether formal or informal, are begin to lose their meaning, don't they? They become absurd. So this brings us to the Budapest memorandum on security assurances signed in December 1994, which was an agreement between Ukraine, the United States, witnessed by the United Kingdom, and between Ukraine and Russia, witnessed by the United States and the United Kingdom. And Ukraine agreed to relinquish the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, some 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads left over from the Soviet Union, in exchange for security guarantees regarding its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And this agreement was not merely a diplomatic nicety, but a binding commitment by the signatories to uphold Ukraine's borders and protect it from coercion or aggression. And the specific commitments made by the US, UK, and Russia included respecting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, refraining from threat or use of force against Ukraine, not using economic coercion against Ukraine to influence its political decisions, seeking immediate UN Security Council action if Ukraine faced aggression. And these obligations, I think, are clear. The US was not offering aid to Ukraine out of benevolence, but because it was committed under a framework that was meant to prevent precisely the kind of Russian aggression that has since unfolded. It's not about Zelensky prostrating himself in the Oval Office, doing obeisance to the Oval president, the commitment of the US has been demonstrably faltering, particularly under the Trump administration's transactional foreign policy approach, which equates international commitments with commercial deals. When America's support for Ukraine is framed as an act of generosity rather than an obligation, it distorts the reality of international agreements, of particularly the Budapest memorandum. Ukraine was effectively disarmed under the promise that the US and the UK would ensure its security. And the breach of this agreement is not just a moral failing, it's a strategic blunder that undermines the credibility of international treaties. To demand gratitude from Ukraine for partial support after years of watching its territory encroached upon, and after initially hesitating to provide military assistance, is akin to a contract breaker expecting praise for fulfilling only parts of their obligations. This isn't about obeisance. It isn't about prostrating in the Oval Office, but about holding the US accountable for commitments it freely entered into. And Russia's violation of the Budapest memorandum is self-evident. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, the paramilitary infiltration from 2012 onwards, the covert war in Donbass through these paramilitary groups, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, all of these are direct breaches of the agreement. But there remains a question. Is modern Russia, of course, bound by agreements made by the Soviet Union? Well, the answer is unequivocally yes. Yes. Russia inherited the USSR's permanent seat on the UN Security Council, its nuclear arsenal, its foreign debts, and crucially, its diplomatic commitments. So that's not an excuse either. Russia has rebranded itself, yes, but it hasn't severed itself from its international obligations or its previous commitments. It's from what it had before. Putin's use of proxy forces, paramilitary groups, Wagner, mercenaries, Russian-backed separatists, was a transparent attempt to maintain plausible deniability while still exerting military control over Ukrainian territory. And the ideological backbone of Russian aggression in Ukraine is the concept of Novorussia, a revival of an 18th century territorial claim that Russia used to justify its imperial ambitions. First invoked by Catherine the Great, then briefly by pro-Russian separatists in 2014, and now by Putin himself. Novorussia serves as a revisionist historical narrative to delegitimize Ukrainian sovereignty, to circle round the written agreement that Russia had entered into with Ukraine. The 2014 invasion of Donbass was not a spontaneous uprising, but a premeditated Russian operation with GRU officers, FSB agents, Kremlin-backed militias orchestrating the destabilization of eastern Ukraine, and the use of groups such as the Wagner Group, the Sparta Battalion, the Russian Cossack paramilitaries allowed Moscow to claim that the war was an internal Ukrainian conflict, when in reality it was a calculated aggression of the next door, the neighbouring state, refusing to honour its own treaties. And the faltering Western commitment to the Budapest memorandum equally has wider implications than Ukraine alone. If the US and UK fail to uphold their commitments, fail to keep their word, what message does this send to other nations considering disarming or seeking Western security assurances? Our word is no longer our bond. Even when we sign a bit of paper, it doesn't mean anything. Why would any state trust international treaties if those agreements are abandoned when inconvenient? The same thing is true of the 1951 Refugee Convention. If bits of it aren't favourable, go back to an international conference and renegotiate it. That's what Zelensky said about the Minsk agreements. And that's one of the reasons I suggest that Putin invaded Kyiv, because he wasn't prepared to have that negotiation. For all of Trump's populist appeal, his dismissive attitude towards US alliances and obligations has left a deep scar in just a few weeks on America's global credibility. If Ukraine is forced to submit to Russian aggression while the West dithers, the precedent is set. Power, not law, determines sovereignty. And that debate, by the way, is the debate which is central to the Broadway musical Camelot. That's why Arthur is presented setting up a round table, so ideas can be discussed and agreed upon in a civilized way. Putin's war in Ukraine is a product of both Russian imperialism and Western weakness. The Budapest memorandum was not a vague diplomatic statement, it was a promise. When America fails to uphold its word, it does not deserve gratitude for its partial compliance. A partner who betrays their word should not be thanked for doing the bare minimum. There's no reason for Zelensky to thank Trump. There's no reason for Zelensky to apologize. Trump, as the head of the USA, is barely fulfilling its promises. Barely. And Ukraine, already suffering at the hands of one tyrant, doesn't need to endure the hypocrisy and the revenge of another. The Budapest Memorandum is not charity. It's a test of the integrity of the international order. And right now, that order, led by President Trump, is failing demonstrably.